Chapter 441, Tamer's War, Sky Tasty 2. When they finally reached the top, only small winged clam summons were passively resting there. They were iron rank and didn't seem likely to attack if the garden plants weren't damaged. The view was completely worth the effort. From the Sky Tasty Tower rooftop, they could see practically the entire combat zone. And what they saw left them speechless for a moment. "My God," Larissa whispered after some seconds passed. The scope of the destruction was beyond anything they had imagined. What they could see from ground level had been only a fraction of the true chaos unfolding across the battlefield. The war was at its maximum height, and the Gold Crest seemed to be losing quite badly. The chaos was indescribable. Soldiers running in all directions while attacks came from the flank opposite to the one the children were observing from. The coordination that should have characterized a professional army had completely broken down. Instead of organized formations, there were only scattered groups of soldiers trying to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. But the most shocking thing was the golden glow. "The spores," Ren murmured, feeling horror, yet some fascination. The visual confirmation of his weapon's effectiveness was both satisfying and deeply disturbing. In the chaos of the attacks, soldiers had dispersed the spores Run had sent throughout the formation. Already practically more than 60% of the army glowed with a sickly golden radiance, infected soldiers moving with increasingly erratic movements. The infection spread was terrifying in its efficiency. What had started as targeted strikes had become a systematic contamination that threatened the entire enemy force. "There's only one large section at the front of the march that doesn't glow," Luna observed, pointing toward where the bridge would be. "It's separated from the rest, but it seems caught up in a furious battle too." The isolated section represented either exceptional discipline or desperate containment efforts. Either way, it suggested that some part of the enemy force remained combat effective. Rin studied the battlefield, processing the information Mashido provided. "We can't do anything yet," he finally murmured. "Not until the battle calms down a bit." The reality was harsh but undeniable. Entering an active battlefield would accomplish nothing except getting them killed or captured. "What does that mean?" Leora asked, though from her tone, Ren suspected she already knew the answer. The small mushroom emerged from Ren's head to share what it was discussing mentally with the boy, so the girls could hear it too. "It means you'll have to witness up close the sad reality of one of the worst evils of your species, while we prepare to reduce the casualties from infection that will present themselves at the end of the altercation." The mushroom's perspective was simultaneously clinical and somewhat compassionate, acknowledging both the necessity of their action and its tragic consequences. "Isn't there a way to stop this?" Larissa asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Ren shook his head. "Not with the power we have now. If we want to change things, we need much more." "But don't think about that and do what you can," interrupted the small mushroom. "If you let the city's logistics handle this alone, maybe thousands of lives that could be saved will be lost, no? Focus on what you can do." Mashido emerged completely from his hair, its small eyes directing toward the distant battlefield. When it spoke to them, its tone was unusually serious. "I know it seems sad to you," the small mushroom said, "but many organisms are like this. Constant fighting is part of what most living beings are. That may never change." The philosophical observation carried a perspective that transcended human concerns about morality and justice. It paused, as if considering its words. "At least don't worry about the infection. I can go alone to recover it when this is over. You don't need to expose yourselves to danger." The offer was generous, but it misunderstood the nature of their commitment to this mission and to each other. Ren sighed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "No," he said finally, both to Mashido and to the girls who had heard the conversation. "I decided to send the spores. It's partly my responsibility, so I'm going to accompany you as soon as we can enter." "We agree too," Larissa said immediately, speaking for all three. "We came here together, and we're going to finish this together." Her royal training had instilled in her a sense of duty, a commitment to seeing important tasks through to completion. Luna nodded silently, her wolf materializing partially as a protective shadow. And if something goes wrong, Leora added, her willow wisp pulsing with determination, it's better to have backup. Ren looked at his friends with some concern. This is going to be dangerous, he warned them. We know that about following you, Larissa responded firmly. But we also know that if we don't do this, a lot of innocent people are going to die. Bushido pulsed with what Ren interpreted as resignation and respect. Very well, it communicated. But when the time comes, follow my instructions exactly. From their privileged position in the tower, the group settled in to observe and wait. The battlefield stretched before them like a tapestry of chaos and destruction, dotted with the golden glow of spores they would soon have to face. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part, watching events unfold while knowing that their moment of action was yet to come. Then, in the distance, the earth split in two at the hands of a prince, an expert in earth magic, separating Karzan's soldiers with new walls. And from behind him, the woman destined to unleash even greater chaos emerged. A bit earlier, Julius observed the battlefield from his elevated position on the Earth Tower he had created, evaluating the perfect moment to launch the decisive attack. Beside him, Selphra adjusted Sirius's ring on her finger, feeling how the additional power flowed through her system. Are you ready? Julius asked, though he already knew the answer. The question was more ritual than inquiry, a final confirmation before crossing the point of no return. The weight of command demanded such moments of clarity before committing thousands of lives to action.
I've been ready since that coward betrayed our kingdom. I just needed an acceptable reason to tear his head off. Selphra responded coldly, her eyes fixed on the enemy formation where she knew Karzan was hiding among his troops. Julius nodded and turned to the section commanders who had gathered around him. The faces before him showed some determination but more nervous energy, mostly young soldiers about to lead their first major engagement. 6,000 soldiers against 15,000 plus 5,000 on the way. On paper, we should be crushed. In any conventional engagement, their forces would be systematically overwhelmed and destroyed. But this was far from a conventional battle. Yet we're not fighting against 20,000 soldiers in normal conditions. The chaos that the golden spores had created in enemy ranks was enormous. Karzan's soldiers moved erratically, constantly examining themselves and their companions for signs of infection. The paranoia was as effective as any weapon, turning allies into potential threats and transforming organized formations into suspicious clusters of isolated individuals. Paranoia is eating them alive, Julius murmured, watching enemy soldiers flinch away from their own comrades.
Chapter 442, Tamer's War, Decisive Momentum. The self-inflicted psychological warfare had exceeded all expectations. What should have been a disciplined military force had become a collection of individuals more concerned with their own contamination than with defense. Selphra smiled. That boy's weapons have proven more effective than expected. They can't trust each other. For a while they don't know who's infected and who isn't. Julius studied the enemy behavior. Indeed, it's like they're fighting against themselves. Their enemies have become their own worst enemy, suspicion and fear accomplishing what direct assault might never have achieved. Exactly, Selphra nodded, her impatience finally showing again. So, it's about time to put your numbers to work, as you declared more than an hour ago. One of the veterans cleared his throat, bringing attention back to immediate military concerns. Orders, sir. Julius straightened, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. These were young soldiers, many fighting in their first real battle. But they were also Abyss Wall soldiers, trained specifically to face threats that exceeded their individual capabilities. Listen carefully, Julius began. We're going to hit the right flank with everything we have. The numbers are against us, but their morale is shattered. Aggressive wedge formation at the front of their march with 4,000 effectives, he continued, visualizing the deployment like pieces on a strategic board. Maintain constant pressure on the other sides with the remaining 2,000. Don't give them time to regroup or think about anything other than surviving the next minute. The strategy was daring in its simplicity. Use their concentrated force to open a way to Karzan while secondary forces prevented enemy reorganization. It was a plan that tried to succeed through overwhelming local superiority rather than overall numerical advantage. Remember, many of their soldiers are more worried about infection than about you. Use that fully to your advantage. The commanders nodded and began withdrawing to organize their troops, but Julius stopped them with one final order. And tell the boys this isn't just a battle. This is the moment we save our kingdom. The attack began like an avalanche. Julius's forces rained down on Curzon's right flank with power that surprised even the attackers themselves. Additionally, the basic strategies they had learned during wall training worked without major difficulty against distracted and disorganized enemies. "Maintain formation," shouted a captain while his squadron broke the first line of enemy defenses. "Don't scatter." But scattering wasn't even a problem. The growing enthusiasm of the young soldiers was actually an advantage. Julius's young soldiers were beginning to realize this was easier than they had expected. The shift was visible in their movements. Shoulders that had been tense with anxiety now moved with confidence. Voices that had been tight with fear now carried notes of excitement. "Did you see that?" One soldier shouted to his companion while taking down an enemy who had been more concerned with examining a golden stain on his arm than defending his position. He wasn't even paying attention. The observation spread through the ranks like wildfire. These weren't the disciplined, dangerous opponents they had been expecting. These were distracted, paranoid individuals more concerned with their own contamination. Confidence spread through the ranks like fire in dry grass. Soldiers who had begun the battle nervous and outnumbered now advanced with growing boldness. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Young faces that had shown fear just minutes before now displayed determined aggression. "We've got them," shouted another. "They keep retreating." Julius observed from his command position how his troops' morale was visibly elevated. The young soldiers who had feared this battle all morning now executed increasingly daring maneuvers, pressing advantages they hadn't expected to find. The situation was evolving faster than even his most optimistic projections had suggested. What should have been a grinding, costly assault was becoming a breakthrough that could end the war. "They're becoming overconfident," Selfra murmured, though there was approval in her voice. "It's fine," Julius responded, his attention divided between the immediate situation and the larger strategic picture. "Confidence is better than fear right now." The momentum was everything they needed in this kind of assault. Once enemy morale broke completely, the numerical disadvantage would become irrelevant as resistance collapsed into individual panic. But there was something else happening. Julius could feel it in the air, a growing density of mana. "Do you feel it?" Selfra asked, noticing his expression change as he processed the new sensory information. "The mana residue," Julius nodded, his understanding crystallizing as he spoke. With so much intense combat, so much magic being released, the battlefield had become a concentrated cauldron of magical energy, thousands of beasts and tamers releasing power simultaneously. "It's accelerating the infection," Selfra completed the thought, her eyes brightening with understanding. "The spores are feeding on the temporal environmental mana." Julius observed the battlefield more carefully and realized she was right. The golden glow that had been gradual was now visibly spreading through enemy ranks. "It's not going to take hours," he murmured, awe creeping into his voice despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. "At this rate, they're going to collapse in minutes." As if he had prophesied the future, minutes later, a massive crash resonated from the Earth Tamer's defenses that had been protecting the center of Curzon's formation. "So soon," Julius shouted, unable to hide his amazement. "The central defense has failed." Indeed, the Earth elemental barrier that had been the last obstacle to the heart of the last healthy enemy formation began crumbling. Not even an hour had passed since they had initiated the attack, and they had already achieved what in a conventional battle should have taken days of siege. "Look, the front section," Sirius observed, "where Curzon, his best troops, and the Abyssals are, seems determined to abandon the others." The enemy's core formation was executing what appeared to be a fighting withdrawal, sacrificing their contaminated forces to preserve their most valuable assets. It was tactically sound, but morally devastating. "We can't give them that option," Julius responded firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that this moment would determine everything. "It's now or never." Sulfura nodded, summoning her white serpent, while Julius and the select elite group prepared for the final push. "It's time to let you enter," Julius completed his thought, gesturing toward the breach his army had created. The moment had finally arrived. All their preparation, all their waiting, all their patience had led to this single opportunity that might never come again. Sulfur smiled, but there was something fierce in the expression. "It's time to take this ring for a walk." Chapter 443, Tamer's War, Convergence of Fury. Karzan finally had no excuses left. Valdris and the others could no longer hold him back. The moment had arrived. It was time to let his rage run free, to face the old woman who had dared attack his castle, who had humiliated his family, who had turned his home into crystal ruins. The corrupted fury that had been boiling inside him for hours finally had a clear target, a focus for all the accumulated rage and desperation that threatened to consume him from within. "Get aside," he roared at his subordinates while walking to the front and pushing them, his multiple abyssal beasts stirring under his skin like hungry serpents. "This is between her and me." His subordinates scrambled to obey, recognizing the futility of further restraint. The best tamers, the gold ranks from both sides, prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive confrontation. The spore infection hadn't affected them much. Their energy seemed to be at a higher level, and the golden spores had difficulty absorbing it and establishing themselves in such dense systems. Though they weren't totally exempt, Karzan could see small golden stains on some of his allies, reminders that even gold rank power wasn't immune to old Yano's new weapons. Sulfura launched toward him with that lethal calm in her eyes that had terrorized generations of enemies. Her spear pointed at Karzan's neck, as if already choosing exactly where to pierce. The weapon seemed to advance with its own malevolent intelligence, seeking flesh with the hunger of a predator that had been denied its prey for far too long. Karzan Goldcrest. Her voice cut through the air like breaking ice. "Don't you have the guts to face me directly?" "Shut up, old witch." Karzan spat, but just as he was about to launch himself at her, Sulfura acted first. She invested 1/10 of her energy in an ice attack that would wreak havoc on the enemy formation. From her hands, a massive flow of ice stakes was born like a mountain, pointing forward and rapidly expanding, each projectile large enough to pierce through multiple soldiers. The assault was both beautiful and terrifying, a crystalline wave of destruction that transformed the battlefield into a killing field of razor-sharp ice. "I won't allow you to keep spreading your crap." Karzan roared, his abyssal beasts responding to his fury with violent enthusiasm. His power was also high despite having almost lost his golden lion during combat with Sirius. His corrupt Simurgh had helped him regenerate it quickly, and after these almost 10 hours since the battle with Sirius, it was in decent form again. The fire from his false phoenix began to combat the ice flow. Or tried to. Karzan's firepower, being a secondary enhancement boosted only by his Simurgh, barely reached 550 points of elemental control. Even if he transformed completely right now, he would barely manage to graze 700. Sulfura's ice flow was too powerful. Her elemental control, enhanced by Sirius's ring, exceeded 900 points, a difference that turned Karzan's attempt into barely enough to keep him covered from the avalanche. Valdris helped him, recognizing that he needed immediate assistance. He and his Pyroclast shell bear stepped forward without hesitation. From the beast's volcanic snail shell, a concentrated fire eruption provided the 320 points of remaining power they needed to level the field. The rescue was perfectly timed, but it came at the cost of revealing their limitations to an enemy who would exploit every weakness without mercy. And it wasn't enough to completely cancel Sulfura's ring-enhanced control of 960 total. Together, they barely managed to split Sulfura's attack and maintain their strong central position. The cost was terrible. Only those directly behind Karzan and Valdris emerged unscathed. To the sides, several gold rank 1, gold rank 2, and abyssal soldiers took the hit, some full-on and others partially, their screams of agony filling the air as ice pierced through common plate armor, corrupt defenses, and flesh alike. Perfect opening, Julius murmured from his position just behind Selphira, observing how she had reduced the number of enemies that way, separating and isolating forces, so his approximately 25 gold rank assistants would have a fair battle against fighters who hadn't been eliminated or separated from the main formation. When Karzan and Valdris's attack ended and the ice melted into vapor and steaming puddles, the battlefield reorganized. Within the arena, separated by enormous walls of ice and earth, Selphira stood at the front alongside Julius, while the other gold-ranked tamers positioned themselves on the flanks, some flying on aerial beasts, others ready to attack from the ground. Karzan's surviving soldiers did the same, forming a curved defensive line around their leader. Two forces of roughly equal power preparing for a confrontation. Selphira advanced the point of her ice spear and aimed directly at Karzan's head again, the gesture so full of lethal promise that several enemy soldiers trembled. Karzan became even more enraged. The main enhancements he had, 970% in strength and 950% in regeneration, though undoubtedly elevated thanks to having 4 abyssal creatures, weren't enough against the relentless ice of the similarly leveled ancient woman. He needed more power. "If you want it," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Come take it." He transformed completely, releasing all the abyssal energy he had been containing. His beasts fused with him in ways that defied normal anatomy, creating a hybrid form that pulsed with purple and golden power. His body became something that existed at the intersection of multiple species, powered by energies that defied conventional understanding. Now Selphira would face a Karzan with enhancements up to 1,330% in strength and 1,310% in regeneration, and with general minimum enhancements of 670% in things like elemental control and resistances. It was a transformation that would have terrorized any other opponent. Although Selphira barely had 960% in vitality and elemental control of her 2 base elements with Sirius's ring's help, and general values of minimum 580% in all other categories, and on paper, seemed to be dominated by the pure power numbers. Karzan had made a mistake showing his secret card too early. When Selphira saw that Karzan would go all out from the beginning, she smiled with that frozen expression that preceded her enemy's annihilation. She touched Julius's hand as they had agreed they would in case of necessity, allowing the young prince to do the same as she would. Sirius's ring pulsed with amplified power, and Julius and Selphira's energy intertwined with that of their beasts. When Selphira fused with the result of her fusion, the lesser Genbu, her values doubled. Now she faced Karzan with 19-20% in elemental control and vitality, with general values exceeding 1,160%. The mana levels weren't so different, but the specialization was. The numbers that had favored Karzan seconds before now looked insufficient in comparison. For what would be the longest 30 minutes of his life? Did you think a little abyssal corruption could save you from 4 centuries of experience? Selphira asked, her voice carrying the cold of eternal winters. Karzan realized, too late, that he had gravely underestimated the situation in which he would face his opponent. "It's time to fulfill my promise," Selphira murmured, and launched forward with a speed that made the air itself crystallize in her wake. Fortunately for Karzan, speed was an elevated statistic for his beasts. With 1,210%, he barely exceeded Selphira's 1,160%, and his beast-altered body gave him advantage in stride length and muscular enhancement. The marginal advantage was all that stood between him and immediate death, a razor-thin edge that might last seconds or minutes depending on how well he could exploit it. But Selphira's technique was pristine and difficult to read. He barely managed to lean backward when the spear passed through where his neck had been a moment before. The near miss was so close he could feel the cold radiating from the crystalline weapon, showing him that his next mistake would very likely be his last. Chapter 444, Tamer's War, Frozen Fury. Karzan was being heavily dominated by Selphra. The superiority she had achieved through fusion was translating into a dominance that no amount of desperate attempts could overcome. "Wake up! Support the Liberator!" Valdris roared, his voice cutting through the air like a command whip. All at once. Don't give her a chance to breathe. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Watching his leader being systematically dismantled by a single opponent was breaking the morale of the soldiers who had followed Karzan lies. Karzan's allies launched forward like a wave of golden and corrupt destruction. Aerial beasts dove, while terrestrial creatures charged from multiple angles, creating coordinated chaos that should have overwhelmed even Selphra. But Julius wouldn't allow something like that. Fused with his two beasts, and now wielding the power of the lesser yellow sand dragon he had gained in fusion, Julius became a force of nature. His horns had grown and shone with golden light, while his body manifested crystal armor. "Don't interfere," Julius shouted, extending his arms in a gesture that carried the authority of geological forces. The ground beneath enemy attackers instantly transformed. Pillars of earth and golden sand sprouted like geysers, dividing enemies and forcing them to fight in smaller groups against Julius's tamers. A triple tamer with a Pegasus and two corrupt beasts found his mount trapped between two crystallized sand columns, forcing him to fight on land. Julius's soldiers immediately took advantage. The aerial superiority that should have been the enemy's greatest asset had been neutralized in seconds, turning a dangerous flying opponent into a grounded target struggling against unfavorable terrain. Another, with a griffin connected to another abyssal, was forced to navigate an aerial labyrinth of earth spires that Julius manipulated in real time, while another Yano attacker harassed him from blind angles that the earth rose to cover, protecting the prince. The three tamers Julius faced were now manageable for him, and taking the attention of several was perfect as it lightened the load for the others. His mind was working on multiple levels simultaneously: personal combat, terrain control, and strategic coordination, all flowing together in a seamless display of advanced combat leadership. "Perfect terrain control," murmured one of the soldiers while witnessing Julius's demonstration of power. The young prince had transformed the entire battlefield into his personal domain, where every rock and grain of sand obeyed his will. In the center of all this coordinated chaos, Selphra and Karzan danced their mortal jig. Karzan, transformed into his monstrous form, was an amalgamation of horrible abyssal power. "Die, witch!" he roared, launching a combination of corrupt fire and golden claws that would have disintegrated a building. The attack carried the accumulated frustration, the desperate rage of a leader watching his carefully laid plans crumble into chaos and defeat. Selphra moved like cold water, her ice spear tracing perfect arcs, thrusts and cuts that deflected each attack while counterattacking. Where Karzan was brute force and overwhelming power, she was refined technique and lethal experience. "For centuries of practice," she murmured while her spear found an opening between Karzan's claws, against a few years wasted on corruption. The ice point pierced Karzan's left shoulder, but the Simurg's regeneration combined with abyssal power closed the wound almost instantly. Purple vapor rose where pure ice touched corrupted flesh. Ren's purification had also found its way into the ancient woman's clear ice crystals, adding another layer of damage that sought to cleanse corruption at its source. But against someone so powerful like Karzan, purification still had a low conversion rate. The accumulated corruption couldn't be undone with single strikes, no matter how precisely delivered. "It's not enough." Karzan laughed with hysteria, his multiple eyes gleaming with abyssal madness. "My regeneration is greater than your attack damage." As long as he could regenerate faster than she could inflict damage, time would eventually tip the scales in his favor. But Selphra wasn't trying to kill him with individual wounds. Each touch of her spear left frost that didn't melt, ice that slowly spread through Karzan's body like a reverse infection. The strategy was as patient as winter itself, each small victory building toward an inevitable conclusion that no amount of regeneration could prevent. Valdris realized the problem at the same time as Karzan. "Lord Karzan," he shouted, directing his pyroclast shell bear towards Selfra. "She's freezing you. Get out of there." The volcanic bear charged with speed that defied its size, its shell radiating heat that made the air distort. Flames erupted from cracks in its natural rock shell, while it prepared to ram Selfra from the flank. But Selfra had been waiting for that intervention. Without taking her attention from Karzan, she extended her free hand toward Valdris. An ice wall sprouted from the ground, not to stop the bear, but to redirect its charge directly toward one of the earth pillars Julius had created. "Valdris, careful!" Karzan shouted, but it was too late. The pyroclast shell bear impacted against the crystallized earth column with a sound like mountains colliding. The resulting explosion sent fragments of rock and sand in all directions, creating a smoke curtain that temporarily concealed the central combat. Selfra took advantage of the distraction. She launched toward Karzan with speed that made her form look blurred. Her spear, now charged with all the power she had been accumulating, cut through the air like a ray of pure winter. This was the moment she had been building toward, the culmination of patience and strategic positioning finally converging into decisive action. Karzan, partially blinded by smoke and with his left extremities beginning to numb from accumulated ice, reacted by pure instinct. His lion's claws ignited and tried to intercept the spear. The desperate defense was all reflex and desperation, the kind of last-ditch effort that might succeed through luck, if not through skill. The clash was spectacular. The ice spear met golden claws in an explosion of vapor and energy that illuminated the entire battlefield. For a moment, both combatants were suspended in air, force against force, ice against corrupt fire. But despite Karzan's superior buffs in strength, the spear overcame the defense, deflecting the force and entering his chest. Around the strongest fighters, the secondary battle had reached its own climax. Julius had managed to completely isolate enemy forces. His terrain control was so precise, he had effectively created a dozen individual duels where his allies had clear advantages. "Push left," shouted one of the high-level soldiers, and immediately 2 Yano flyers coordinated to trap a Yano triple against one of Julius's earth walls. In another section, twin brothers with black crystal crabs had cornered another triple tamer whose beasts were completely out of their element in the dry, rocky terrain Julius had created. "The advantage is ours." Julius observed with satisfaction how each of his positionings bore fruit. But his attention was drawn back to the central duel when a purple-blue shockwave radiated from where Selfra and Karzan fought. Selfra had won the direct clash, her spear piercing through Karzan's defenses and finding corrupted flesh. But the cost had been that Karzan had managed to wrap his serpentine tentacles around her, imprisoning her in an embrace that promised to absorb her power. The reversal was sudden. If Karzan could drain her energy while his regeneration healed the spear wound, he might still achieve victory from the brink of defeat. "I've got you." Karzan laughed with malicious triumph, his multiple appendages compressing around Selfra with crushing force. The grip was designed to be inescapable, tentacles that could crush stone and drain magical energy from even the most powerful opponents. But Selfra smiled. "No," she said with frozen calm that carried the certainty of absolute victory. "I have you." The frost that had been accumulating on Karzan's body during the entire combat suddenly activated from the spear's point. Like crystals growing at impossible speed, ice spread from every previous contact point, covering 90% of Karzan's monstrous body in a matter of an instant. The transformation was beautiful and terrible, corruption being systematically encased in crystalline purity, each infected cell being frozen into immobility before it could regenerate or adapt. "What?" Karzan tried to move, but discovered his frozen extremities no longer obeyed his orders, and his tentacles shattered at the slightest movement from the ancient woman. Chapter 445, Tamer's War, Fury's Embrace. Karzan was frozen, his extremities transformed into ice statues that pulsed with purple pain where purification fought against abyssal corruption. But his claws held Selphira's spear firmly embedded in his flesh, and his monstrous smile stretched across the three mouths that adorned his face. The crystalline prison that should have meant his defeat had become a stalemate, his supernatural strength allowing him to maintain his grip even while most of his body remained immobilized. "Did you think it would be so easy?" he growled, vapor emanating from his wounds where pure ice met corrupted blood. The purification hurt him, but his 6 beasts and he were now one entity. They couldn't be purified so easily while regenerating each other retroactively. The corruption had deep roots that would require more than surface cleansing to eliminate. Selphira pulled on her spear, but although her muscles gradually gave their maximum, she discovered she didn't have more raw physical strength than Karzan. It wasn't her specialty, and Karzan's body multiplied his integrated strength to the beast's base, not his own. It was frustrating. Centuries of skill and technique meant nothing if she couldn't overcome the brute physics of the situation. Selphira's muscles tensed with maximum effort, but the spear with which she wanted to cut off his head remained firmly trapped. Valdris saw what was happening and immediately directed all his bear's power toward melting the ice that imprisoned Karzan. The veteran general didn't need instructions. His experience told him exactly what needed to be done. His pyroclast shell bear charged toward the pair locked in combat, its shell radiating heat waves that made the air itself distort. "Concentrated heat," Valdris shouted. The bear released a volcanic heat wave directly toward Karzan. It wasn't enough to completely melt the ice that imprisoned him and slightly damaged his lord, but it was sufficient for some joints to begin loosening. Karzan immediately felt the difference as his Simurg's enormous power regenerated his wounds. His claws tightened even more around Selphira's spear. Perfect. The regeneration was visible, corrupted flesh knitting itself back together with supernatural speed while purple energy pulsed through his hybrid form. But Julius was already moving to neutralize the threat. "Don't interfere." The fused prince launched a golden sandstorm. "Spatial absorption." Julius roared, and something extraordinary happened. The Earth Wolverine that had fused with his Chelan manifested not only as armor, but as the master controller of his expanded internal space. A technique that in fusion he could use in a more advanced way to control space not only within his body, but also in things that were covered by his Sans power. Valdris's pyroclast shell bear was caught in the dimensional space of the sand mound, cutting the temporal connection with its tamer. "What?" Valdris staggered, feeling the loss of connection with his beast companion like a punch to the stomach. With this, Julius had managed to prevent interference for Selphira while simultaneously dealing with the other 3 enemy tamers. Without his bear available to attack, and with Julius effectively neutralizing the beast within his own internal space, Valdris suddenly found himself powerless. His decades of battle experience were reduced to nothing without his lifelong companion. In seconds, he had gone from effective support to helpless bystander. Why did everything seem to go against his lord in life? He had tried so hard since youth. The memories hit him like an avalanche. A younger Karzan, standing in the throne room with slumped shoulders. The king had just denied him the second ring and the right that corresponded to him to be the gate guardian, all because of genetics, and some supposed chosen one whose name had barely been decided a day before. The injustice of it still burned after all these years. Karzan had been the obvious choice, skilled, dedicated, loyal. But politics and bloodlines had trumped merit and service. "No," he murmured, watching how Selphira gave up her attempt to extract the trapped spear. "Fine. I don't need to use my favorite spear to cut off your head," Selphira said coldly, her voice carrying winter's inevitability. "I can decorate it after killing you." A new ice spear materialized in her free hand, this one thinner but almost equally lethal. Designed with a blade instead of a point, what they would have called a glaive if they had nomenclature for weapons, a design more useful not for piercing, but for separating heads in this case. Karzan struggled against the ice that imprisoned him, but his extremities barely responded. His four eyes widened with something that might have been fear if corruption allowed him to feel such emotion. "My lord," Valdris shouted. He remembered those months after the king's rejection, how Karzan had been affected, wandering the castle halls like a ghost of himself. And in the corner of that memory, a small Kashan, barely 8 years old, looking at his father with confused eyes, not understanding why the man who had carried him on his shoulders seemed so sad and broken. Karzan had accepted things years later, had found purpose in leading his faction, in building something of his own, until one day he had exploded. It seemed like out of nowhere, hidden pain had been released, decades of resentment sprouting like pus from an infected wound. Right after that came that crow. Valdris had never agreed with resorting to external powers. His decision not to acquire abyssal beasts for himself, even though it would have meant more power, had been clear from the beginning. He trusted that his Lord Karzan, that boy he had advised since childhood, could achieve great things on his own. The principle had seemed so important for him, then, maintaining integrity, refusing the easy path of corruption, believing that natural development was superior to artificial enhancement. But now, seeing Selphra raise that second spear, seeing the terror barely hidden in Karzan's eyes, Valdris finally understood it a little, the allure of the search for power, since he would give anything for a little more power right now. The understanding of his lord's hunger for power came too late to change his past decisions. But perhaps there was still hope. Selphra directed her new weapon toward Karzan's exposed neck. Valdris moved. The blade cut through everything, his armor and his torso instead of Karzan's neck. He didn't arrive with a fused beast's enhanced speed, not with the strength of decades of training, only with the desperation of an old man who had served the same family for more than 60 years. Pure ice instantly froze a divided body and a heart that had beaten with loyalty for decades, and stopped it instantly. "Valdris," Karzan whispered, his multiplied voice carrying an emotion that abyssal corruption hadn't managed to completely hide. His eyes closed, but not before seeing something extraordinary. Valdris's death, the emotional shock, the pure rage that shot through Karzan like lightning. Everything combined to break the chains of his consciousness and surrender completely to corruption. With a roar that combined pain, fury, and something deeper, Karzan freed himself from his crystalline prison. The ice that had held him captive shattered like glass, purple energy exploding outward in a display of power that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. Valdris, his final cry wasn't that of an abyssal monster, but of a man who had just lost the last vestige of his humanity. Chapter 446, Tamer's War, Crystallized Fury. Selphra retreated, surprised by Karzan's sudden release of power, but was already preparing her next attack. On the ground, Valdris's body lay motionless, having paid the final price for decades of unwavering loyalty. Karzan's roars of pain over Valdris's death resonated across the battlefield, but something deeper was happening. Pure emotion, unfiltered rage, had broken not only the ice chains, but also the last barriers he maintained between himself and abyssal power. The transformation was more complete than anything he had experienced before, not just physical enhancement, but the absolute abandonment of everything that had once made him think as a human. Karzan let himself go completely. He allowed the beast to take his body, fusing at a level that transcended simple symbiosis. His form reconfigured, muscles and bones flowing like malleable clay, while 6 creatures became a single, perfectly integrated entity. The process was beautiful and horrifying to witness. He was so merged with abyssal power that he even managed to feel something that should have been impossible at this distance. The crystal's voices. New child of the abyss controlled by the stasis strings, they whispered in his mind, arriving from kilometers away like echoes from a deep cavern. "You can hear us." The connection was startling in its clarity. Karzan stopped for a moment, surprised by the clarity of communication with voices he had heard completely unintelligibly only once before. The Grand Crystal, which should have been too far away to be heard on this side of the kingdom, had somehow established direct connection with him. "Let us see through your eyes," the voices continued, and Karzan felt a strange presence exploring his perception. Through his multiple eyes, the crystal observed Selphra, analyzing every nuance of her power, every energy pattern that emanated from her. The inspection was thorough, like a scholar studying a particularly interesting specimen. "Interesting. She has purifying power. It's weak, but strange," the voices murmured with something that sounded like concern. Could this be the one who has stolen the parts that the light core needed? Karzan didn't completely understand what they were talking about, but he could feel the evaluation the crystal was making. "In the end, it doesn't matter," the voices concluded with cold indifference. "If the parts aren't together with the correct method, they'll never reach their maximum expression. But this woman could be a future problem." The crystal's attention then focused on the battle developing around Karzan. "As our child of the abyss fights against the possible usurper, it would be better to eliminate her if possible." And then Karzan felt how something massive and ancient directed its enormous capacity toward him. Power flowed through the abyssal connection like a cascade of purple energy. It wasn't just raw power, it was control, precision, crystallized knowledge being transferred directly to his fused form. Karzan began moving as if the mutated body had been his from birth. Where before he had been somewhat clumsy with his new hybrid form, now every movement had lethal grace that defied his monstrous appearance. His many extremities coordinated perfectly, and his agility increased to levels that made Selphra blink with surprise. "What?" she murmured, immediately noticing the change. Her centuries of experience told her that what she was witnessing shouldn't be possible. Karzan smiled with all his mouth simultaneously. The expression was more unsettling than any battle roar. Selphra responded with her new spear, executing that technique she had perfected during decades of combat. The ice spear moved as if it were alive, creating attack patterns that should have been impossible to predict or dodge. Each movement was a masterwork of martial artistry, the culmination of centuries spent perfecting the deadly dance of close combat. But Karzan blocked them all, his form contorted in ways that violated normal anatomy, dodging by centimeters while counterattacking with combinations that forced Selphra to retreat step by step. "Impossible," Selphra panted, blocking a claw that would have decapitated any other opponent. "Your control shouldn't be so precise." A combination of voices within Karzan completed the sentence, while his scorpion tail sought an attack angle that Selphra barely managed to avoid. "Surrender, old usurper." The battle had completely reversed. Where before Selphra had been controlling the combat's rhythm, now she could barely defend herself. Her energy diminished with each exchange while Karzan's seemed to grow constantly. But the effect wasn't limited only to Karzan. The energy the Grand Crystal was channeling spilled over to other abyssal combatants in the battle. Julius noticed the change immediately when the triple tamer he had been facing suddenly moved with feral speed he hadn't shown before. "What the hell?" Julius murmured, barely dodging claws that moved like purple lightning. Throughout the battlefield, abyssals who had been fighting in relatively controlled manner became faster, wilder, more lethal. Their eyes glowed with more intense purple light. "They're strengthening," shouted one of Yano's commanders, watching how an abyssal soldier tore through one of his men's defense with ferocity he hadn't shown moments before. Things that had been so in Yano's favor began to tilt dramatically toward the Yano Goldcrest alliance. The reversal was sudden and complete, the kind of battlefield shift that could determine the war's outcome. "Regroup," Julius shouted, recognizing that the battle's dynamics had changed. But even while giving orders, Julius knew they were in trouble. The change wasn't simply power. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was as if an external force had decided to tip the scales. In the center of everything, Selphra fought desperately against a Karzan who seemed to have transcended his previous limitations. "Your technique is impressive," Karzan admitted while his attacks forced Selphra to retreat even more. 3 out of 5 claws found their mark, tearing through Selphra's ice armor and leaving 3 bleeding lines on her left arm. But 4 centuries of life are nothing compared to millennia. Selphra realized with growing horror that she wasn't fighting only against Karzan. The voice, the coordination, the impossible recovery, all spoke to something far older and more dangerous than any individual tamer, no matter how enhanced. "What are you?" she demanded, using a defensive technique to gain a few seconds of respite. "I'm the future," Karzan responded, his voice carrying harmonies that weren't human. "And you are the past." The next attack came with force that made the ground crack under Selphra's feet. For the first time in decades, the legendary warrior found herself genuinely outmatched. And for the first time since the battle began, she considered the possibility that she might lose. The small mushroom remained outside of Ron, sitting comfortably on top of his head like a living hat. Lately, it felt more comfortable being outside in the world for periods and talking with its boy. It was quite entertaining. The creature had developed something approaching personality, preferences, and opinions that went beyond simple biological imperatives. "How strange to see you so relaxed," Ren murmured, observing how Mashido seemed to be enjoying the panoramic view from Sky Tasty Tower. From their elevated position, they could clearly see that the battlefield had divided into 2 completely distinct zones. The part that wasn't divided by the powerful battle developing at the front, where enormous walls of ice and earth separated the others, was full of infected soldiers. The vast majority of those common soldiers were already falling victim to constant bombardment from the 2,000 Yano soldiers attacking from distance, combined with the devastating effects of the golden spore infection itself. "Look at that." Larissa pointed toward a section where infected soldiers staggered like zombies, some with golden fungi sprouting from their extremities. "They can barely stay standing. And the bombardments don't stop," Luna added, observing how energy projectiles constantly rained on enemy positions. But Mushido, who had been observing placidly, suddenly tensed. Its small eyes directed towards something the others couldn't see, and its form began pulsing with anxiety that Ron had never witnessed before. Something strange was happening, an energy that even made Julius's 2,000 attackers stop for a moment, as if an invisible presence had passed a giant hand over the battlefield. Chapter 447, Tamer's War, Tasty Calculations. Ren and the girls felt part of the energy too, but couldn't completely understand the ominous nature that Mashido could perceive. "Did you feel that?" Leora asked, rubbing her arms as if she had felt a chill. Her will-o-wisp flickered nervously, its pale blue flame responding to energies that its mistress could barely feel. "Like something very big is watching," Luna nodded. Her wolf moved like a restless shadow at her side. The dark wolf's supernatural senses were clearly detecting something that made it uncomfortable, its form wavering between materialization and dissolution as if it couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. Larissa looked toward Ron with concern. "What's happening?" But Mashido had completely lost his previous tranquility. The little creature that had been so relaxed and confident just moments before now radiated anxiety that was almost scary to witness. Its usual composure had been replaced by panic. "What's wrong?" Ren asked immediately, noticing how his small companion seemed genuinely alarmed for the first time since he'd known him. "What is that energy?" Mashido remained silent for a moment, as if processing information. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with tension. "It's something I didn't think I'd encounter being so small," he finally murmured, his voice carrying enormous worry that contrasted completely with his diminutive size. "From what I can sense, it's grown to levels I didn't expect so soon. Is someone really—" "What has grown?" Larissa insisted, her royal training demanding clear answers to direct questions. "What are you talking about?" "They're beating me, by a lot," Mashido continued, but seemed to be talking more to himself than to them. The small mushroom started vibrating on Ren's head, clearly processing some type of complex calculation. "Why?" Ren tried to get his attention. "Explain to us what's happened and is there something we can do?" Leora asked, seeing the creature's obvious anxiety. Is it dangerous for you? Luna added without taking her gaze off the perfect jelly body of the small mana being. But Machido seemed unable to hear their questions, completely absorbed in whatever analysis he was performing. The girls exchanged worried glances while Ren tried to obtain more information from his silent companion. The air around them seemed to have become heavier, as if the strange energy they had felt continued growing in intensity. On the battlefield below, even the soldiers who had been constantly bombarding remained motionless. I need the absorbed energy from all those infected soldiers more than ever, he declared with urgency that made the 4 children startled. If I don't get it, I'll lose the race. What race? Ren asked, completely confused. What are you talking about? We don't understand anything, Larissa declared with frustration that reflected all their feelings. Can you explain what's happening? Suddenly, Machido jumped from Ren's head, clearly prepared to launch himself toward the battlefield. His movement was so quick and determined that it caught the girls off guard. But this time Ren was alert to his antics and managed to catch him mid-jump. Don't be foolish, he exclaimed, firmly holding his companion. The soldiers are constantly bombarding, and there are still many enemies standing. They'll tear you to pieces, and you'll take a long time to regenerate. Machido looked at him with an expression that Ren interpreted as exasperation. The frustration radiating from the small creature was huge, like a caged animal that could see freedom just beyond its reach. There's no time, the mushroom responded, struggling to free himself from Ren's grip. If we wait then... His voice cut off abruptly. Then what? Larissa asked, her patience finally reaching its limit. Finish the sentence. What happens if we wait? Leora insisted, her own anxiety rising in response to Machido's obvious distress. Luna moved closer. Whatever it is, we can help you. But you have to tell us what's happening. Machido looked at each of them, as if evaluating how much he could reveal. The understanding hit Lionel like a physical blow. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence that 10 gold-level tamers from Yino appeared exactly now, exactly when most of the main defenses had been drawn away toward the main conflict. Someone had been planning this. Someone had been waiting for exactly this moment of vulnerability, when the castle's defenses would be at their weakest and response options would be most limited. And, judging by Cashin's laughter, that someone had connections that Lionel had significantly underestimated. Guards! Lionel shouted, immediately shifting toward combat readiness. Defensive formation. Incoming hostiles, 10 gold-level units. But even while giving orders, Lionel realized that 4 guards, however powerful they were, against 10 gold tamers including a double, in enemy territory, with potential prisoner allies inside. The odds weren't exactly in his favor. And for the first time since he had taken control of Goldcrest Castle, Lionel began to wonder if he had been a bit too confident about his ability to hold territory that technically wasn't his yet, against enemies who clearly had been planning this since way before the moment he had arrived. Cashin's laughter continued, growing more confident with each passing second, as if he could taste the approaching freedom and revenge. Lionel's 4 high-level guards fought with everything they had, but from the first exchange it became clear they were doomed. They weren't just facing 10 enemies of similar rank, but among them was a powerful double with gold ranks who stood out like a storm among breezes. And his main beast, that 3-legged crow, was nothing to underestimate. Lionel tried to use ice like his mother, channeling his power through techniques he had learned during years of intensive training. Ice crystals sprouted from the ground, creating barriers and spears that should have given his group a defensive advantage. But his level was much lower than Selphra's. Where his mother would have created impenetrable walls, Lionel barely managed to form shields that crumbled under the first serious attack from gold ranks. His ice spears also disintegrated against their defenses like toothpicks against armor. It's not enough, he murmured with frustration, watching how his best techniques proved useless. He achieved nothing important. He hadn't even had time to take Cashin out of the crystal prison to take him hostage, a tactic he had considered. The battle ended faster than he had expected. The sound of crystal breaking resonated through the castle, as one of Yino's gold ranks destroyed the prison door. "Lord Cashin," the rescue soldier called. "We're here to get you out." Cashin emerged from the prison with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, followed by his relatives who seemed more relieved than surprised by the rescue. The family's reaction suggested they had been expecting this outcome, as if the rescue had been anticipated rather than hoped for. "Perfect timing," Cashin murmured, but Lionel noticed something strange. Cashin's hands moved subtly, as if he were manipulating something invisible in the air. The gestures were too specific to be nervous habits, too purposeful to be unconscious. "What are you?" Lionel began to ask, but Cashin ignored him completely. "Ravenspire," Cashin addressed the rescue group's leader, "take my relatives to the other side on the largest beasts. This territory is for now dangerous for them." His tone was casual, as if he were discussing the weather instead of coordinating an evacuation during an active war. "Of course," Ravenspire nodded, but there was something calculating in his expression. The deference was professional, but carried undertones that suggested complex political relationships. "And me," Cashin continued, "take me to my little brother's school before leaving. I'm going to take him too. I think he still serves us." And finally, Lionel felt a stab of terror, seeing that Cashin was turning toward him slowly. The movement was deliberate and predatory, like a cat that had finished playing with its prey and was ready to deliver the killing blow. "And what about Selfra's idiot son?" he asked rhetorically, directing his gaze toward Lionel for the first time since he had emerged from prison. He made a cutting gesture across his neck with his finger. The gesture was simple, unmistakable, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Lionel immediately panicked. "Wait," he shouted, instinctively backing away. "We can negotiate. I could do anything. My family has resources, territory, power." The desperation in his voice was raw and undisguised, the kind of fear that stripped away all pretense and revealed the fundamental terror of impending death. Cashin and Ravenspire looked at each other and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of dramatic villains or the cruel laughter of torturers. It was a shared laughter of two people who had just heard something useful. "Anything? Oh, Lionel, but you really have to want it." Cashin shook his head, as if scolding a child for a minor mischief. "If you truly desire it with your heart, we have something for you. Since Klein has failed so much, it's convenient for us to have a plan C." He turned to Ravenspire. "Did you bring that unpleasant beast?" Ravenspire nodded with a smile that promised pain. Lionel swallowed hard, his mind racing through all the terrible possibilities. Chapter 448, Tamer's War, Peak Powers. Shortly after, Lionel was unconscious but alive, his body motionless on the marble floor that had once been a living room. "The seal on young Lionel's chest will disappear sooner than the previous ones," Ravenspire explained to Cashin while they observed the unconscious body, "so young Cashin shouldn't worry about it being discovered easily." There was something almost professional in his tone, as if he were explaining the side effects of an improved medicine rather than describing the results of abyssal corruption. "Perfect," Cashin nodded, satisfied with the result. "Now, before going to that school," said Ravenspire with an expression that had become more serious, "we're going to support your father a bit. Obtaining the bridge is imperative for the next step toward the castle." "Fine," Cashin grimaced, "but I want to stay on a large beast and not get close to the action. You know I can't lose control of the threads of fate right in the middle of battle. Don't move me much during the flight." Ravenspire raised an eyebrow, wanting to ask if they had already entered battle at the front with Karzan. But Cashin's hands moved much faster than normal in those strange patterns. It was enough of an answer. "Ah," Ravenspire murmured with understanding. "Of course." Karzan pressed with implacable force. Each blow from his multiple extremities forced Selfra a step back. Each combination of corrupt attacks obliged her to spend energy on defenses that barely contained the power channeled by the Grand Crystal. "Surrender once and for all, old woman," Karzan roared. "Your luck has run out." Selfra dodged a claw that would have pierced her chest, but another found her left thigh. Hot blood soaked her clothes while she retreated, creating ice walls that Karzan destroyed like paper. The wounds were accumulating faster than her healing could manage while fighting, each injury representing another step toward inevitable defeat. Around her, the situation also deteriorated rapidly. Julius fought desperately against 3 abyssal opponents whose speed had increased. His earth control, previously dominant, now barely managed to maintain basic defenses while corrupt claws sought spaces between his barricades. "I can't hold them," Julius shouted, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead where a claw had passed too close. The other Yano commanders faced similar problems. Beasts that minutes before had been manageable now attacked with supernatural frenzy, their eyes glowing with that purple light that gave them new power. Selphra made the decision in a fraction of a second. She jumped back and channeled a massive amount of her remaining energy, feeling how reserves she had carefully conserved emptied like water through a broken dam. The air around her crystallized while power accumulated, creating fractal patterns. Selphra buried her new spear in the rocky ground up to the middle of the hilt. Her hands freed themselves, both palms directing toward Karzan, while the lesser Jinbu's power channeled through her. The air thickened, ice crystals forming spontaneously in environmental humidity. Absolute domain mountain peak. The cold that followed wasn't simply low temperature. It was the complete absence of heat, the type of cold that existed on the highest peaks where only a real dragon could survive. It spread from Selphra like an expansive wave, converting the ground into a slippery surface of black ice while the air itself began to crystallize. The technique was beautiful and terrible, the culmination of centuries of ice mastery focused into a single demonstration of absolute environmental control. Karzan's abyssal allies who had been pressing Julius froze instantly. Their movements became slow, clumsy, until some finally stopped completely, converted into ice statues with expressions of permanent shock on their faces. Some allies had time to take advantage to finish their battles, but soon found themselves affected too. Julius himself felt the cold biting his extremities, but managed to create earth barriers for most allies that protected them from the worst of the effect. Yano commanders took shelter inside the improvised structures, breathing vapor while the world transformed into an Arctic wasteland. The entire battlefield had become black ice, except for Karzan. The crystal's voices whispered precise instructions, while purple energy and false phoenix fire concentrated not around his body, but within it. Instead of generating external flames that would compete directly against Selphra's superior ice, the energy worked internally. His body temperature elevated to levels that would have killed any normal being. Muscles heated from within, melting ice that tried to form in his joints. The Simurg's extreme regeneration activated constantly, repairing excessive heat damage as fast as it occurred. Karzan took damage. His skin cracked from extreme internal heat, vapor emanated from his wounds, but he kept moving. More than that, accelerated regeneration acted like a natural steroid for his strength, which was already extremely high in principle. His muscles tore and repaired dozens of times per second, each cycle of destruction and regeneration leaving them stronger, denser. Selphra concentrated on maintaining the temperature drop, trying not to affect her allies too much as they struggled to stay warm behind their improvised shelters. But she didn't understand why Karzan kept advancing toward her. The ice under his feet should have paralyzed him. The temperature should have frozen the blood in his veins. But step by step, Karzan crossed the frozen battlefield, leaving a trail of vapor where internal heat partially melted the ice. 10 meters. 8. 5. Selphra realized too late what was happening. She stopped concentrating on lowering temperature and reached her hand toward her buried spear, but Karzan was already upon her. His claws, overheated by internal energy, pierced through her defense and found flesh. The pain was immediate and terrible. Selphra felt how the claws perforated her body, the searing heat of Karzan's extremities creating vapor on contact with her blood. For the first time in decades, Selphra Ashenway had been gravely wounded. A few hours earlier, Victor maintained a stable front from his privileged aerial position. The enemies had apparently accepted that they couldn't break Yano's defenses through the bridge bottleneck or the bowl with direct attacks. Instead, they had resigned themselves to an attrition battle, constantly sacrificing numbers to try to exhaust Yano's resources and resistance. But Victor had advantages they hadn't anticipated. Archuro's reinforcements and provisions kept arriving in constant waves. Soldiers from the Central Reserve, units that had been withdrawn from less critical positions, veterans who had run from the kingdom's depths. His forces had grown an extra of almost 5,000 effectives. The logistical support was impressive in its scope and efficiency, demonstrating the kind of administrative competence that won wars as surely as tactical brilliance. Commander Victor, a messenger approached flying on his silver hawk, with a smile that promised good news. Reports from the front against Karzan. Victor felt genuine relief hearing the soldier's words. Julius, Sirius, and Selphra had managed to completely stop Karzan's march advance a while ago. The golden bombs had been even more devastating on solid ground than on the bridge, infecting and incapacitating more than 50% of enemy forces. The numbers are strongly negative for the enemy, sir, the messenger continued. If our leaders manage to win the main battle against Karzan, at this rate, the war could end in our favor soon. Victor nodded, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. Everything had gone better than expected. Ren's bombs had proved to be the decisive factor that neither side had completely anticipated. But then his eagle-enhanced eyes detected something strange on the horizon. In the distance, an aerial formation that had been dispersed for hours seemed to be reorganizing. Dozens of dark points moved in coordinated patterns, regrouping into something that resembled an attack formation. Is Maximilian attempting a desperate strategy? Victor murmured, studying the distant movements. It made no tactical sense. The enemy commander had proven to be calculating and careful during the entire battle. Launching a desperate aerial attack against Yano's superior air defenses would be, but Victor decided to prepare troops for a counterattack if necessary. A few minutes later, Victor observed that the formation was definitely advancing toward his position. Are they insane? He asked aloud. The enemy was committing exactly the same mistake he had made hours before, exposing themselves too much, moving away from their support base, trusting in individual superiority against superior numbers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Seeing his own tactical error reflected in enemy decision-making provided both satisfaction and concern about what desperation might drive them to attempt. Victor gave the signal immediately. "Aerial squadrons, reception formation," he shouted, his voice amplified by his beast's mana to reach all commanders. "Position yourselves within ground support range." It was time to apply what he had learned during his own tactical error. His aerial forces would move within range of fire and wind soldiers on ground, creating a support network that would make any enemy attack suicidal. "Prepare concentrated fire," he ordered ground commanders. "When they arrive, we give them everything we have." But then Victor felt something that made him stop mid-order. A massive power was approaching. It wasn't Maximilian's familiar mana signature, whose energy he had learned to recognize during hours of intermittent observation. This was something completely different. The squadron approaching had a new leader. Through his eagle-enhanced eyes, Victor could distinguish the figure leading the formation, a man in armor that glowed with purple energy, mounted on a poison wyvern that radiated power in a way that made the air itself distort. "Vinmont," Victor murmured, recognizing the leader of one of Yano's 3 most influential families. But something didn't add up. Victor had interacted with members of the great families before, enough times to calibrate their relative power. The power he felt emanating from Vinmont felt too high, dangerously high. The enhancement was beyond anything he had previously encountered, suggesting modifications or empowerments that transcended normal tamer development. What the hell? Victor frowned, recalibrating his own defenses while trying to evaluate exactly what he was facing. The energy he detected wasn't simply that of a high-rank gold tamer. It was something that transcended normal classifications. "Commander," One of his lieutenants approached with worried expression. Orders? Do we maintain reception formation? Victor hesitated for the first time in hours. Would they be capable of defeating that? Maintain positions, he finally decided. On the horizon, the enemy formation approached implacably, and with each passing second, Venmont's anomalous power became more evident. Chapter 449, Tamer's War, Turning Points. Victor had fought with all his power. His gold rank, 3 Qilin, had provided him massive earth control, creating barriers and mineral projectiles that should have been decisive due to his elemental advantage against any aerial opponent. His resistance should also have been extraordinary with that matchup. His eagle had few rivals in the sky. Speed, maneuverability, elevated attack power, and very high precision. But none of that had mattered. Venmont's gold rank 2 wyvern was no longer simply his equal. The power of 5 other gold rank 1 beasts, flowing in perfect synchrony, had created an advantage that Victor had no way to overcome. The mutated beast he faced barely retained the basic form of a wyvern at the end of their battle. The additional power lines had transformed its silhouette, expanding its now 4 wings to monstrous proportions, giving it extra extremities and thickening its neck with much more muscle mass that pulsed with visible purple energy. It approached much closer to the form of a true dragon. Victor now flew straight toward the ground, but not by choice. His eagle, missing one of its wings, spun erratically alongside him in a rapid fall toward the ground, both bleeding profusely where Venmont's beast's transformed claws had found their mark. The ground approached at terminal velocity. Above him, his troops both in the sky and on land desperately attacked Venmont's mutated beast. Fire projectiles, wind spears, combined techniques that would have destroyed entire formations. The attacks impacted against the transformed creature's advanced wind control and dispersed like breeze against a mountain. The combination of 6 gold beasts had created defenses that transcended normal capabilities, a resistance that converted even coordinated attacks into minor irritations. No amount of coordination could overcome the fundamental power disparity that the new Yino enhancements had created. The impact against the ground was devastating. Victor crashed with force that made nearby defenses tremble. Dust and stone fragments rose in a cloud that temporarily obscured the vision of nearby combatants. When visibility cleared, Victor lay motionless in a crater of his own creation, his beast transformation flickering weakly, threatening to vanish completely. The sight was shocking to witness. Their aerial commander, who had dominated the skies for hours, reduced to a broken figure struggling to maintain consciousness. Venmont prepared a powerful storm attack from the heights, his mutated form radiating triumphant power while observing the fallen aerial commander. The attack was clearly intended to be final, not just to defeat Victor, but to eliminate him and demonstrate the futility of resistance against his power. Yano's troops fell silent for a moment, processing what was happening from one moment to another. Their commander, who had dominated the skies, had been defeated by a power they didn't understand, and that power was about to eliminate them all. Earlier, Ren and the girls had run from the tower with the urgency that Mashido had insisted was crucial. The small mushrooms idea was relatively simple. Make the affected people who weren't yet unconscious on the left flank gradually approach to form an absorption network with the same infected spores. That network would gradually expand to all other infected. They had reached the battlefield's perimeter panting, but their first communication attempts had failed completely. The infected soldiers who were still alert to possible bombardments were absorbed in themselves with a new mark of power that was perceived within the arena where their leader fought with forces difficult to understand. "They're not listening to us," Leora shouted, frustrated after trying to direct soldiers covered in golden spores toward where Ren and Mashido waited. "They must be more affected than we thought," Luna murmured, observing how an infected soldier walked in circles, apparently lost. Ren made the decision to change approach. He approached the first unconscious infected person they found, a young soldier whose chest rose and fell laboriously while golden fungi sprouted from all over his body. Mashido jumped in his hair, considering touching the soldier directly, but then shook his head in a gesture that surprised Luna with its cuteness. "It's better if you do it," the small mushroom communicated to Run. "Inside you, the contact area is larger. The power will be assimilated faster due to synergy between us. Besides, you learning the sensation can't be bad." Machido allowed himself to be absorbed, and Rin extended his hand, hesitantly, toward the unconscious soldier. The moment his fingers touched the infected skin, the golden spores began reacting to mana patterns that Machido formed through him. It was a strange sensation, like small electric currents running through his arm. Machido could have simply absorbed the spores directly, but decided on something more efficient in the long term. He used them to form roots first, helping to germinate with his own spores too in a hybrid process that Rin could feel developing under his skin. The sensation was unlike anything Rin had experienced, not painful, but profoundly strange, as if his body was being transformed and expanded. The girls observed the process from behind, as Machido had asked them, maintaining a safe distance, but ready to defend Rin if something went wrong. The roots that began growing were super thin, but incredibly long. They extended from the contact point like a nerve network, silently covering the terrain toward dozens of unconscious soldiers scattered throughout the area. Rin felt each extension as if it were part of his own nervous system. It was exhausting in a way he had never experienced. The mental strain was different from physical fatigue or magical exhaustion. It was the overwhelming sensation of consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity. "It seems this is the maximum possible with our own energy," Machido murmured in Ren's mind. "Is this all we can cover?" Ren asked, concerned about the limitations they were discovering. "It's only the beginning." Machido responded with confidence that contrasted with Ren's mental fatigue. And then the real absorption began. Through the root network, Machido began draining golden spores from all connected soldiers simultaneously. Rin felt how power flowed toward him in waves, each cured infected person adding energy to the system. Chapter 450, Tamer's War, Turning Points, Failed Promise. All fallen soldiers lost the infection quickly. The golden fungi that had been growing on their bodies withered and disappeared, absorbed by the light roots. Their breathing became more stable, their colors healthier. The intense glow that began emanating from Rin finally attracted the attention of infected soldiers who were still conscious in the vicinity. "What is that light?" one of them murmured, approaching instinctively. Several more followed him, and when their bare feet or broken boots touched the roots that now extended widely across the ground, something extraordinary happened. The roots began healing them too. "It's healing!" shouted a soldier upon seeing how the spores on his arms vanished. "Look, the infection is going away." It was like a savior appearing in the middle of misfortune that many of them had never wanted to experience. "Don't get close to him," Leora shouted, alarmed by the uncontrolled bunch of soldiers approaching, but Larissa immediately saw the opportunity. "But you can bring all the infected to the vicinity," Larissa shouted to approaching soldiers. "Everyone you care about can be brought close to the light network on the ground to be cured." The response was immediate and emotional. Soldiers who felt better after only seconds in contact with the roots began remembering companions, friends, brothers who had also been infected. Many decided they had important people to save and began searching among the unconscious. "My brother is over there." A young soldier ran toward an area where several infected lay motionless. "Help me with the sergeant," another shouted, carefully dragging an older man toward the expanded network. With power absorbed from the first cured, Machido grew the network again, extending roots even further. Soldiers who carried unconscious people toward the healing zone attracted the attention of more conscious infected soldiers. The procession began advancing rapidly toward the light. More soldiers arrived, carrying infected companions. Some dragged several at once. Others organized groups to transport the most gravely affected. In few minutes, hundreds of soldiers had been purified of golden infection, and each cure fed an enormous network that didn't stop growing. Ren had become the center of a phenomenon that transformed not only infected bodies, but morale and perhaps in some cases the old loyalty to the enemy army thanks to having witnessed the miracle. Victor was being dragged by retreating soldiers, his unconscious body swaying on the back of a beast, and its tamer who ran desperately toward the city's interior. Behind them, hundreds of Earth Elemental tamers did everything in their power to absorb Venmont's storm blows. Massive rock walls sprouted from the ground, only to be destroyed by the beast that seemed to have transformed into a true dragon. The defensive line had completely fallen. Yino soldiers from the bridge poured into the city like an unstoppable tide, following Venmont, who devastated everything in his path. It wouldn't be long before they reached the terrorized evacuation groups, and it looked increasingly difficult for them to get Victor to the castle before being overrun by Yino forces. Victor now depended completely on the speed of others' legs to survive. In the main arena of battle against Karzan, yet another tragedy unfolded. Sulfur spat blood while screaming with effort that tore her throat. The drop in environmental temperature hadn't stopped Karzan, but in direct contact, Sulfur's power was much more than simple cold. It was the absolute absence of heat, the type of power that could stop time itself. When the ancient woman touched Karzan's arm with both hands, not even the monster's enormous regeneration was sufficient to counteract it. In direct contact with the ancient woman's ice mana, his arms ended up completely frozen, then his entire body followed. Even with the crystal's voices guiding him desperately, Sulfura destroyed Karzan's frozen arms with a single blow. Fragments of ice and corrupt flesh flew in all directions while she, without time to treat her own mortal wound, only allowed extreme cold to stop the bleeding from the enormous perforation in her side. The injury was devastating, yet her determination seemed to transcend physical limitations in ways that spoke of a willpower forged across centuries. But freezing him wasn't enough. Internal heat grew again. Karzan's arms were already regenerating at visible speed, and his body broke ice from within while vapor sprouted from every pore. The regeneration was relentless, powered by even older energies that refused to acknowledge defeat. Sulfura pulled her glaive from the ground where she had buried it and swung with all her strength to cut his neck in a decisive movement. The blade separated Karzan's head before he could free himself completely and finally ended the battle. Or that should have been the case. But halfway through the cut, the blade found unexpected resistance. Corrupt forces had transformed Karzan's neck thickness into something enormous and much more resistant than expected. Muscles had expanded, skin had hardened, and the glaive got stuck before completing its work. Fatigue and pain from a wound hadn't helped either. Her strength was rapidly fading, each movement costing more effort than her reserves could sustain. But Sulfura found enough time to take her main spear and tear it from Karzan's torso with a desperate pull that shattered ice and reopened wounds that the monstrosity Karzan had already managed to heal. Yet the monster had already completely recovered his arms and broke residual ice with a deep corruption-enhanced heat waves. Sulfura screamed and used the last of her remaining power in a final desperate attack. The spear directed toward the partially cut neck, seeking to finish what the glaive had begun with the weapon most dense in mana from all her repertoire. The weapon that represented her own power and that she had nurtured for so many years within her beast's abundant mana. But Karzan reacted in time. His muscles, more enhanced by the steroid of regeneration and destruction than ever, contracted around the spear like a living trap. By squeezing with superhuman force, Sulfura's spear broke. Ancestral ice that had survived centuries of battles shattered between the corrupted claws. The destruction was even symbolically devastating, not just the loss of a weapon, but something that had defined her identity as a warrior for so long. Karzan pierced Sulfura again with the claws of his other arm in a tragic attack that spent the ancient woman's last forces. This time, there was no resistance. No ingenious counterattack with ice power. Only the terrible sound of claws perforating flesh and the muffled moan of someone who knew she didn't have a speck of remaining mana to counterattack. The brightness in Selphira's eyes slowly extinguished, like candles going out one by one in a room, sinking into eternal darkness. Each breath cost her more effort than the previous one. Each heartbeat sounded more distant. Perhaps it was time to close her eyes. For centuries were enough for any soul, even one as stubborn as hers. She felt increasingly less connected to the present. It was as if most of her had been left lying in the past, scattered among losses she had never completely processed, past joy she had missed too much, sorrow she had converted to ice to avoid having to feel them. Faces began appearing in her blurred mind. Soldiers she had lost in battles no one remembered anymore. Friends who had aged and died while she remained, immutable like permafrost. Her eyes slowly closed. But just before darkness claimed her completely, she felt a touch on her shoulder. A warm light brought her abruptly back to consciousness, but with an amplitude she had never experienced. It was as if every fiber of her being had awakened simultaneously, as if she could feel not only her own body, but everything surrounding her. The happiness that still remained flowed through memories she had kept buried for decades. The most important moments that had brought her here, promises throughout her existence she had fought to fulfill. In the end, two faces emerged with perfect clarity. Laura's smiling face, full of life, joy, and hope, and Leora's tender face as a baby when born, so small and perfect that it had made Selphira cry for the first time in centuries. Selphira smiled. "Grandmother." The cry followed the memory, Leora's voice resonating just behind her. Suddenly she could feel everything with enormous clarity, like having eyes behind her head. No more than that. For pairs of eyes. One pair in each of those touching the light child. Perception expanded exponentially, connecting her with each person in contact with the power network that radiated from Ren. Ren was touching her shoulder, his small hand burning with purifying power. He held Larissa's hand, who glowed with intense light only less than his. Leora and Luna touched Ren's back, having been dragged by the long light jump when touching him at the last moment. Even Sirius appeared from her shadow, using all the little power he had managed to recover in recent hours to stop with his last standing beast the claws of Karzan's other arm that were directed to cut the ancient woman's neck. Everything appeared in extremely slow motion. The power Ren had just transferred to her was incredibly pure and warm. Selphira made an instantaneous decision. She wouldn't use ice to avoid harming the children touching her. She used just water. But it wasn't common water. Pure and brilliant water that sprouted from her like star tears. So hot with purifying power that it burned Karzan's transformed form on contact and healed the mortal wounds in her torso. The external armor that abyssal beasts had created in Karzan melted like wax, returning his silhouette somewhat to normal. But most of Karzan's body was so integrated with corruption that it simply pulverized on contact with the purified water. Selphira extended her left hand toward fragments of her destroyed spear, and her right hand took the glaive. Water touched pieces of ancestral ice, and something miraculous happened. Fragments joined with the glaive to reform her spear, but not as it had been before. The spear became whiter, brighter, sharper, and as if forged from solid light instead of common ice. But corruption didn't surrender without fighting. Crystal voices became enraged upon sensing so close the presence of purifying brightness in the ancient woman. They increased corruption's power to maximum, channeling energy that made the air itself turn purple with concentrated malice. Karzan's partially destroyed body swelled with abyssal power, regenerating at impossible speed while the crystal voices screamed annihilation orders. Selphira didn't surrender either. With a cry that combined 4 centuries of determination with pure power Ron had given her, she injected everything she had left into the reconstituted spear. The blade became so bright it was painful to look at directly. It was pure light converted into weapon, hope transformed into lethal edge. The blow that followed cut through corruption as if it were mist. The pure light spear pierced Karzan's thickened neck in a brutal cut that separated head from body in a single perfect movement. Absolute purification. Karzan's head fell to the ground with a dull sound, his eyes losing purple brightness while corruption vanished like smoke in the wind. Selphira immediately fainted, but with a smile of complete satisfaction adorning her face. She had fulfilled her promise.